Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. You may be seated.
Good morning, all.
Morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
Morning, Dr. Von Gurnett.
Good morning.
Dr. Von Gurnett, yesterday when we broke for the day, we had started chapter 5 of your slide deck, your demonstrative. We were skipping around a little bit. To me, it seemed. We had started slide 71, but I wonder if I might take you back to 70 for a moment. Now, you told us that slide 70 represents, it's a table, of course, and it represents a table that you had created based on numbers that were in Sprague's memorandum that you took us to yesterday. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
And I just had a question about, you said that Sprague used time of treaty population for his proposal,
Yes,
and you've listed them here in the second column of your table, the RST and the RHT respectively. Is that correct?
yes.
And can you tell us anything, if at all, what the 1873 per capita annuities tell us about the population as of 1873?
Well, the populations in respect to RST had likely risen.
And how can you say that?
Well, because the amount per capita has decreased. Because this was always a function of you may recall that right from 1851, from the first annuity payment, each individual was entitled to the share of the annuity.
Yes.
And so it varied from year to year. And so in the very first year, it was in the order of $1.61 or so, and then it rose to 170, and then it sort of fluctuated over the years. And so if it's 149.5, that means the population has increased.
And can you tell us anything about the RHT population as of 1873?
Well, it likely increased as well.
And how can you tell that?
Because it's now, well, actually, I have to go back and look at the first year payment in 1851, what the annuity was, to determine whether it went up and down. But Sprague was quite, when you look at Sprague's report, he was quite clear that the whole reason he decided on the time of treaty population is mainly because the RHT population was fluctuating wildly, because there were in-migrations of significant magnitude. There are whole groups that were involved in moving around. And so it wasn't just a matter of population increases as a consequence of natural demographic conditions. It was also a consequence of bands having accepted members from other areas who were increasing the population numbers.
And do you know if that impacted the RST as well?
It's possible. We'd have to go back and read his analysis
This is the analysis you took us to yesterday at
Yes.
221?
Yes,
Can we just go back? One, was your last comment about Sprague a comment about our ST or our HT?
he was, his examples were primarily RHD, as I recall,
RHD.
but I think there were similar problems with the RST.
No, I was just asking what you had said. You said Sprague was clear that that he used time of treaty population because, then did you say RST or RHT? Population was fluctuating wildly.
Yeah, so if we look at page
I just want to
221,
know what you said.
I'm sorry, yes, I was referring to the RHD,
Thank you.
yes. So if you look at pages 221 to 222 of my report, which is the pages that we looked at yesterday,
Yes.
Can we pull that up, please? Are you able to blow that up a little bit? Thank you.
yeah, so here he's referring to the population fluctuation. So one of the things,
Where are you looking, sir?
in his quote on
Yes.
page 221,
Bottom third.
yes, and then continuing first half of the next page.
Top of page 222,
Yes,
we see a reference there to the Lake Superior Indians. Maybe you
yes.
can take us through that, please.
So with reference to, I'm quoting here, with reference to the Lake Superior Indians, the returns for 1871 exhibited a population of 1,453 instead of 1,240, as in 1850, and indicating an increase of 213. This may be due to migrations from the interior, but the preceding annual report gave their numbers at 1,502, whereas the report for 1864 computed them at 1,242. It will be observed that the same fluctuating tendency, which was alluded to in reference to the Lake Huron Indians, is perceptible as respects those of Lake Superior, and therefore it is proposed to take the numbers as described in the treaty, namely 1,240, as the guide in determining the amount necessary to provide for an annuity of increased amount.
Thank you. So that helps me at least to understand when you said yesterday about the fluctuations. Maybe we can move then to slide 71, where you continue with Sprague's response. Could you take us through that slide? I think you started yesterday, sir, but I don't believe we finished.
Yeah, so as I indicated yesterday, Sprague worked on the common assumption that the maximum annuities that were payable under the Robinson treaties amounted to a figure that if you divided it by the time of treaty population would be $4 per capita.
Based on the time of treaty population.
Yes. So once he had those figures, the next step was to figure out how much revenue there was over and above the costs, and of the proceeds that were collected from the land. So he sensed that there must have been some by now, but he didn't have any accurate figures. He was aware that as of 1872, there'd been a fair amount of income from timber, at least in the RHT territory, where most of the timber was coming from.
And was that just a sense that he had, or did he have reports to guide him?
Well, he doesn't ever specify any documentary evidence, I think, in support. But he just makes allusions to the fact that by then there would have been some amount of income from timber. Now, you will recall that Russell back in 1857 had indicated that it was unlikely for some time to come that revenues from the lands would place the government in this position of being able to augment the annuities. So that's now some 16 years.
And that Mr. Russell was in 1857, the UPC. What was he again?
He was the Assistant Commissioner of Crown Lands.
Thank you. And you say here what Sprague concluded, I think. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, so what Sprague said that, quote, it was contended up to a comparatively recent period that the profits realized from those sources were so immaterial as to be inadequate to supply any appreciable increase in the annuities payable under the Robinson Treaty. But whatever they may have been, they should constitute the first contribution towards a fund out of which augmented annuities would be paid.
Now, may I stop you there? You said a moment ago that Sprague knew that there was timber from the RHT territory. That's at bullet point 2. Do you know if Russell is speaking about the RHT specifically, or excuse me, do you know if Sprague is speaking about the RHTs specifically or about the 2 Robinson treaties here?
Well, I think it was generally known that timber was being, if we're talking about the whole region to the north of Lake Superior and Lake Huron, the timber was coming primarily, if not exclusively, from the RHT territory as opposed to the RST territory.
And then can I have you turn the slide over and continue with Sprague?
So, I mean, again, I would recommend reading the entire Sprague memorandum because it's really illuminating. What I did here, sort of in this slide, summarize what he had in mind.
Is the entire Sprague memorandum in the report?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's the portion that you see on pages 221 to 222 is an excerpt, but the entire document is footnoted at footnote 457
Thank
in my
you.
report, which presumably can be tied to an exhibit.
Okay.
Again, we're talking about the April 13, 1873 Sprague memorandum.
As
Yes.
clearly stated in footnote 457. Your Honor, if it's of assistance to you, we can find that exhibit number and tell you at a convenient time.
That would
That'd
be
be
helpful.
helpful.
Thank you.
Go on, Dr. Von Gernert.
So what Sprague had in mind was that the province of Ontario would first confirm whether the revenues had reached the level. And then if that was the case, the province would then transfer the amount or an amount that was sufficient to create a capital fund, which would generate interest sufficient to pay the difference between the minimum that the pre-augmented augmentation that Canada had been paying all along and the maximum treaty obligation as he understood it.
So then to be clear here, the province would transfer an amount. We've now had confederation. So which province are you referring to?
All right, so we're talking about the province of Ontario.
Thank you.
So his idea was to to contact the province, have Canada contact the province, find out from the proceeds, from the records of the proceeds of the lands, whether in fact they were sufficient to meet the conditions of the augmentation clause. And then if so, have the province of Ontario transfer an amount that would form a capital sum sufficient so that the interest from it could pay the difference between the the original capitalized amount provided for.
That was what you told us about yesterday, I believe.
Yes, you may recall that the pre-augmented annuity had been capitalized in 1869. And so there was a capital amount. Remember, we looked at the little spreadsheets that the Receiver General and the Indian Department had. And under RST, there was 40,000 plus change. That 40,000 every year was already generating sufficient interest to pay for the pre-augmented annuity specified in the RST.
And remind us, please, who had capitalized and paid for that?
That had been capitalized and paid for by Canada,
Canada, the Dominion?
the Dominion of Canada, yes. Which was in existence by 1869.
Of course. So then we have his idea. Can you take us through the rest of the slide and tell us what happened to his idea?
Yeah, so really all he was doing here, he's not talking about Ontario paying for the entire obligation under Robinson. That is the pre-augmented annuities. He's not talking about those at all. What he's talking about is only the difference between the pre-augmented annuities and what was sufficient to reach the maximum per capita payment of $4.
I'm
That
not,
difference.
and I'm just going to ask you to slow down so I make sure that I have this right. So Sprague is recommending. Sprague works for the Dominion or the province?
No, Sprague is the Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs for the Dominion of Canada,
Okay,
which is a branch of the Secretary of State.
actually, the departments, I don't need to know so much. So he works for the Dominion.
Yes,
I might need to know them for other purposes, but not this one. So Sprague's idea is that he's worked for the Dominion, and he suggests that the Dominion contact the province to find out whether the proceeds, because the province is receiving the proceeds,
correct,
whether the proceeds are sufficient to meet the conditions of the augmentation clause.
correct.
And if so, to do the calculation between the capitalized amount in place for the pre-augmented annuities. I have a question where that is in place, but a calculation between the pre-augmented annuities and a sum, a capital sum that would be sufficient to generate interest sufficient to pay the annuities at the rate of $4 per capita on pre-treaty populations.
That's correct, but he's not asking.
Sorry,
Time.
time of treaty populations.
Yes,
Okay, so, and that, and the proposal that he's making is for that calculation to happen. So first, that a determination whether the threshold has been met. Second, a calculation to happen. Third, for the province to transfer that, what I'm going to call the difference to Canada, because Canada is paying the annuities.
well, just one correction.
Okay.
He's already made the calculation.
He's made it. All right.
He's already made the calculation. So all he's asking the Dominion to do is to ask Ontario for the particulars relating to the,
If the threshold has been met.
exactly, and if so, then for Ontario to provide the funding necessary to pay the difference.
Thank you. Do I, does that help you or does that confuse anything that
Oh,
where you're
no,
going?
no, I understand, and your understanding is mine. When you say the funding necessary to pay the difference, that's the capitalized amount that you've
Yes.
spoken of and that you took us to in Sprague's table. right?
Yes,
And that is how much again? Because the original capitalized amount was around 40,000.
I believe if you turn back to slide 70, Dr. Von Gurnick can show you there.
yes. So at 6%,
Oh, yes, there were two options.
yes, it was 51,770.
Or 62.
And
Or
that's for the
62.
RST only.
That's only the RST, yes.
Thank you very much.
I think we were on slide 72. Actually.
Yeah, I think we're done.
Before you move on, just maybe for a point of clarification. So then with Sprague's suggestion, this would have both governments contributing?
Well, I think Sprague left, well, first of all, Sprague already understood that the government of Canada was obliged to pay the annuities, and the annuities were being paid, the pre-augmented annuities. The only question was the augmented portion of the annuities, and they specifically referenced proceeds. So the pre-augmented annuities, of course, there was still a question which Sprague did not discuss at all. That question being whether there was that obligation for liabilities pre-Confederation.
And that's what you explained to us with Langton's proposal. is that right?
Yes, but that doesn't figure into Sprague's thinking here at all.
Okay. So do you want to finish off slide 72 then? Is there anything you want to tell us there?
No, I think that's it.
You say that he proposed a hybrid system. Anything you can tell us about that? What do you mean by hybrid system?
Well, it is a hybrid system in the sense that I've used that term elsewhere in my report. And that is that the thinking here is a traditional annuity-based treaty regime where you had a fixed amount that had to be paid. And it didn't matter where that came from. Generally, it did not come from the proceeds, it came from the CRF. But in this instance, the augmented portion, because the Robinson treaties had this unique characteristic in which what he understood to be the maximum augmentation, the maximum annuity would not materialize until certain proceeds had been calculated from the lands. In that sense, it's a hybrid system. So he views the annuity as a fixed annuity coming from the CRF. However, the augmented portion is coming from proceeds.
If you look at slide 73, I think you might have covered this in the discussion already today. Is there anything here that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, he warned his superiors that, you know, if this issue wasn't resolved, that the Anishinaabe would continue to complain. Or he refers to the Friends and perhaps a reference to Dawson and Shoney, who had led the Anishinaabe to believe exaggerated claims about the quantum of proceeds. So Sprague was of the opinion that, there probably were some proceeds, but they were nowhere near what Dawson had claimed. And so he suggested the first step should be that Canada should approach Ontario to elicit the particulars, and then the only flaw in this whole reasoning, as it turned out later, is that he based his calculations on the time of treaty populations. And when you think about this logically, if you do that, then the effect would be that the $4 cap would not be reached under a condition of future population increase. So if the whole purpose was to augment to $4
Per person.
per person, yes. How can you reach that if you're using time of treaty population? And so that portion of Sprague's proposal was eventually abandoned.
And on the next slide, you start to describe what happened to Sprague's recommendation.
Yes.
Can you take us through that, please?
So his April 13th, 1873 recommendations were then communicated to the Privy Council, and it advised that the matter be brought to the attention of Ontario, and then there was an order in council
An order in council by which government?
by the government of the Dominion of Canada. And that order in council directed, quote, that the facts of the treaty and the claims now put forward by the Indians on the grounds thereof be made the subject of a communication to the government of Ontario, and that government be moved to take such steps in the matter as the circumstances may seem to them to be just on the part of the province of Ontario. So the language sort of leaves some discretion to the province as to what is a just solution. So this order in council was then forwarded by Canada in August of 1873, along with a fact sheet that had been prepared by Sprague to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And that fact sheet sort of reveals the understanding that Canada had of the Anishinaabe claim. That is, that the sales of land and timber upon the shores of these Great Lakes had reached a point at which the augmentation clause had been fulfilled to the extent that the $4 were in fact now payable.
Was this $4 per capita on time of treaty population?
That was Sprague's initial recommendation, but
No, this fact sheet. This, you say there's an assertion that the sales of land and timber had reached a point where the augmentation clause had been fulfilled to the extent $4 per capita was now payable.
well, that was Sprague's. That was Sprague's impression, and
But his
he left
impression
it-
was based on time of treaty population?
yes.
Thank you.
And then you told us that that gets sent to Ontario in August. We're in 1873. On the next slide, we fast forward about 6 months or so to March 1874. Can you Can you take us through that?
Yeah, so there was a second petition that was sent to Lord Dufferin. And again, it was under Dawson's covering letter. And
This is the same RST ban that we saw yesterday. had
Yes.
sent a petition.
And in this petition, the petitioners acknowledged that they had ceded these lands north of Lake Superior in return for the stipulated down payment and annuity. But they had discovered that the latter amounted to only $1.60 per capita. As I indicated earlier, it was about 161 at the time of treaty. And they claimed that even this small amount had been reduced over time. Although it would be more correct to say that it fluctuated over time and was currently reduced. The petition also said that, you know, at least there was the augmentation clause, and they believed that the condition described in it had now, quote, been perfectly realized, end quote. The petition said, quote, "The land and forests we have parted with are bringing out and pouring millions in the government's treasure, and our so-called annuity is diminishing from time to time instead of increasing." So, of course, this figure of millions in the government's treasure, that again is the influence of Dawson's rhetorical flourish, which we already discussed earlier. That's not to say that the claim was not valid, but it was based on Dawson's influence, and Dawson kept telling them, you know, there's millions coming in here, you know, you really deserve to get this.
Might have seemed like millions if you were only getting $1.60.
Absolutely.
So this second petition, you've told us, went from Dawson to Lord Dufferin. Did Dawson also send it to anyone in Ontario, do you know?
Not as far as I know. Generally, I mean, Dawson is a federal employee, and he's in no position to send official correspondence to province.
Remind me, what was Dawson's position at this time? Was he now a federal MP?
No, not yet. He was still working for Public Works. He may have been actually, come to think of it,
It might be in your cast. of
yes,
characters.
I think he may also have been, yeah, that reminds me.
You have him on the first page of your cast of
Yes,
characters. at Exhibit A,
he,
or excuse me, Appendix A.
yeah, by this time. Well, he hasn't represented the provincial legislature yet. This is still 1874. So he's not there yet. So he's still a federal employee, as I said. He's still in charge of of public works in the region to the west of Lake Superior. It's the following year. This is why I was hesitating, because the chronology we're right at the transition period here. So it's the following year that he actually represents Algoma in the provincial legislature.
And then you continue, I believe, with the second Fort William Band petition on slide 76. Can we have that up?
Yeah, so the petitioners in this petition, they refer to their brethren beyond the Haida land who recently signed Treaty Number 3. And you will recall that Dawson had been one of the treaty commissioners. So he was intimately knowledgeable of this event. And the petitioners lamented that their brethren in Treaty 3, quote, made themselves wise by our example, end quote. While their own people had been duped on account of their own ignorance. So in other words, their Anishinaabe neighbors who were immediately to the west had arranged for an immediate and guaranteed $5 annuity. Remember, Treaty 3 had a provision for a $5 annuity, but there was no augmentation clause. You got $5 the first year after the treaty was signed. So it was immediately payable.
Did it fluctuate based on population? Or how did that work?
It was not a population-based system. The number of treaties had no population. I mean, in fact, at the time of the signing of Treaty 3, the population was unknown. In fact, the treaty itself has a provision for having a census taken to serve as the first pay list.
Was
And
the
then-
question, sorry, was the question on an annual basis, was it paid to people who were,
Individuals.
it was paid to individuals, but whoever was in the census then, or who
Yes,
existed
whoever
then?
was entitled to under the census
Okay.
was paid the $5. And then once they're on that list, then it's a matter of adding, births and marriages and so forth. And
So
the-
based on a current census list.
Yes,
Okay,
And then you describe the petition at the second bullet point.
yeah, so the petition referenced this complicated arrangement that happened after Confederation. And so it said, quote, when our propriety has passed into other hands, we must be the victims of this new arrangement. Are not the charges weighing upon the land? But the government knows this better than we do. Have we then ourselves to claim to Ontario? Is it not a sacred duty to the government general to make known to Ontario the charges weighing upon that portion of its territory? So they're basically saying, I mean, we shouldn't be claiming to Ontario. We understand the jurisdictional issue. We shouldn't be claiming to Ontario. Look, you're the jurisdiction that should be dealing with this. Surely you can make known to Ontario that we're due these augmentations. So in doing all of this, Dawson, who of course is the quote unquote friend who's behind these petitions and is encouraging them and assisting them with this, he was apparently unaware of the flurry of activity that had already been initiated as a consequence of the previous petition.
And what activity are you referring to?
Well, all of the rapid response after Lord Dufferin received the original petition in the spring of 1873, the subsequent memo prepared by Sprague, the order in council, the communications with Ontario, all of that was happening. So now Dawson's covering letter suggested that while all this was being sorted out, an advance should be issued to the Anishinaabe to alleviate their hardships. As all First Nations were at the time and continued to be over the course of time, they were in conditions of poverty, and Dawson was one of their staunch allies in seeking assistance for them, and he often lobbied on their behalf. And so he thought, you know, they're going to get this money sooner or later. Why should a jurisdictional dispute hold things up? Give them an advance and then, you know, deduct it from whatever is owing to them later on.
Okay. And then this is, as you say, the petition with Dawson's covering letter, it goes to the Governor General. I believe at this point you said it's Lord Dufferin. And what happened next? You have a new section starting at the next slide, 77.
Yes. Well, unfortunately, you know, this is one of these things in history that, you know, is very unfortunate. The most informed and senior civil servant, Sprague, who's been around for 45 years and has had these files for much of that time, dies on April 14th. And is replaced by a less experienced civil servant named Lawrence Van Kootna. And so there was a lapse in institutional memory. There was also a change in government. And so much of Sprague's preparatory work was neglected. And the new officials who came in had a steep learning curve. And at the same time, with the new change in government, there is also a new passionate advocate of the Anishinaabe claim. And that was Edward Boron. Boron is an interesting individual, as you can see from my cast of characters. He was originally a mining inspector. So he knew all about mining. In fact, at one point he was even in charge of the Bruce mines. And from during the 1850s, in fact, right after, not right after, but from 1852 to 58, he was the actual general manager of Bruce mines. So he knew mines really well. And then so he became the Ontario mining inspector for the Lake Superior region during the from 1869 to 73. And then with this change in government in 1874, he became the Canadian or Dominion of Canada Member of Parliament for the Algoma district, which in those days, Your Honor, covered much of the RHT and RST territories. A huge jurisdiction. Today, much reduced, but in those days, it was enormous.
And how did Boron get involved?
So Boron pressed for the Anishinaabe claim. Boron is living in Sault Ste. Marie. So he's close to Garden River, and he's constantly getting, you know, complaints from the Anishinaabe at Garden River. And he considers them to be sort of part of his constituency. And so he lobbies on their behalf over the years. And so he starts pressing the Minister of the Interior. So by this time, the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs is also the Minister of the Interior. It's no longer the Secretary of State. That's another change in the way these governments work. And so he pressed David Laird, who is the Interior Minister and Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And so this pressing by Boron, together with the Fort William petitions and the Dawson's advocacy, prompted the minister himself, Laird, to personally look into this. And he had to start from scratch because his file is completely new to him. He doesn't know anything about it when it falls on his desk. So he starts looking into it. And he didn't have the same command as we go to 78, slide 78.
Who is this who doesn't have the same command? David Laird?
Yeah, David Laird, who's the minister. His comprehension is not as good as obviously Sprague's had been, and he had grossly inaccurate figures. But he came to the same general conclusion. He thought that the claimants, the Anishinaabe claimants, were in fact entitled to increased annuities. And he said that the local government of Ontario should be called upon to quote, enable the Dominion government to make such increase in the annuity, thereby secure to the Indians as they may be thought entitled to under its provisions.
And Dr. Von Gurnett, you just said that Minister Laird, Minister of Indian Affairs, I think you said, his figures were grossly inaccurate. Do you know why?
Well, I compared them to the more accurate ones that Sprague had. And they're not even close. So I don't know where he's getting his figures, but I trust Sprague over Laird. It's because they are in fact in accord, much more in accord with pay lists that I've seen.
Okay. And can you take us through the rest of your slide? Is there anything else you'd like to tell us?
Yeah, so, but the wording is interesting. So, you know, he wants to approach the government of Ontario so that the province can be called upon to enable the Dominion government to make such increases. So he recognizes that it's a Dominion's responsibility to make these increases, but Ontario has to assist in this regard by providing the requisite information. So, and this is where things get really bizarre, because recall that there was already an order in council that had been sent to Ontario on this very matter. And yet here we have another order in council now prepared at the recommendation of Laird. And so the second order in council is dated June 19th, 1874. And it recommended that the Secretary of State communicate this matter to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. So these are very high official correspondence and communications between the top levels of the Dominion government and the top levels of the Ontario government. But it's now the second time that an order in council has been issued. And Ontario, meanwhile, of course, had been considering the first order in council and hence completely ignored the second one because it was already dealing with the issue and did not need a reminder.
That was the 1873 order in council by the
Yes.
previous Dominion government?
That's correct. So meanwhile, Boron continued to press his case this time with the Deputy Minister of the Interior. And Boron claimed that there were significant proceeds from the lands and that the Anishinaabe were not only entitled to those full amounts, which he understood, like everyone else, to be a $4 per capita payment, but that they should also get arrears and interest for what he said was many years past. And because he was now a member of parliament, he threatened to bring this before the House and make it an issue in the House of Commons.
Arrears of interest.
Yes.
Arrears and interest?
Arrears and interest on those arrears.
And then on slide 79, you've now told us about the 2 orders in council that were sent by Canada officials to Ontario officials. Can you tell us what was going on Ontario's end?
So Ontario received the first order in council and then started the process of looking into this. And so there were 2 things that it had to research before it could offer a reply. So the first thing is whether the net proceeds from the lands had indeed become sufficient to warrant the increase. And secondly, if such an augmentation was warranted, that Ontario carried the legal burden of paying for it. So those are the 2 main issues that Ontario researched. And that took a year.
And who did that research? Do you know?
Yes. This whole issue was personally researched and the response drafted by the Ontario Premier himself, Oliver Mowat, an extraordinary person himself. He was a lawyer by profession and was on what at the time in Upper Canada was the highest court. He also, when he became premier, he became his own attorney general because of his legal training. And he had that position for 24 years. He was Premier of Ontario. It was just an incredible tenure. Much of the second half of the 19th century, the Ontario Premier was Oliver Mowat. So he personally researched and drafted this. And so he finally provided his response in October of 1874. And his interpretation of the BNA 1867 Act was led to his rejection of Canada's claim that Ontario was responsible for paying any annuity augmentations. He argued that basically all matters relating to Indians was solely under Canada's jurisdiction, and that at the time of the Union of Canada, Dominion of Canada, Canada had assumed all the debts and liabilities of the old provinces, and that the lands that Ontario inherited were not subject to any kind of trusts or liens or anything like that, including liabilities in the shape of annuities, Indian treaty annuities. Those annuities, he said, they were paid from the Consolidated Revenue Fund and had nothing to do with proceeds from the lands. And he also argued that this whole issue had already been reviewed by Counsel for Ontario during the argument before the 1870 arbitration that I referred to yesterday. At which time the province had established, in his view at least, that that it was not liable. So turning to slide 80 then, he rejected the idea that Ontario was responsible for paying, but he accepted and understood because Ontario had the lands and the revenues, it was appropriate for Canada to inquire whether or at what point the income had reached a level that was sufficient to allow Canada's obligation to provide the augmentations. So what he was basically, if you read between the lines, what he's saying is, Ontario is not responsible for paying, but we are responsible for providing you with information to allow you to pay. That's the main difference between Ontario and Canada's position that starts to emerge in 1874. So Ontario's responsibility, he understood, as I said, to provide information. So to that end, he asked the Crown Lands Office, which is now, of course, under Ontario's jurisdiction. He asked them, well, you know, what are the figures? And so he set his officials or tasked the Crown Lands officials to look into it. And he was left with the impression, and I quote on the second bullet point of slide 80, quote, he had asked for and quote, received information from the Crown Lands Office that the amount received before Confederation in respect of the lands on the north shore of Lake Superior was about 110,000. The amount so received in respect to the east and north shores of Lake Huron, the undersigned has not been able to ascertain. But there is no doubt that enough has been received to entitle the Indians to the increased annuities which they claim.
And are you able to shed any light on why Mowat wouldn't have been able to provide more detailed information about the Lake Huron area?
Yes, and that is explained 2 slides later.
Do you want to highlight it now, or is it better in
Well,
detail later?
yeah, we'll get to it in 2 slides.
Okay. Next slide then, Mowat's legal opinion continues.
Yeah, so Mowat suggested, well, among other things in his response, that this is his official legal opinion, which was sent to Ontario, sorry, to Canada from Ontario. So he also suggested that, you know, if Canada was going to insist that the lands were somewhat subject to a trust, that this should be settled in the courts. At the time, there was no Supreme Court of Canada yet, so you had the Court of Chancery. And then in the meantime, Canada should, quote, settle with the Indians without prejudice to any question as to what government ought ultimately to pay the proposed increase, end quote. So by the end of October, this was converted into an order in council. That was the usual procedure. If a minister, like in this case, the Attorney General, because it's not really coming to Ontario from, even though it's the same person, he's the Premier of Ontario, he's actually acting in capacity as the Attorney General. So an Attorney General's response would then be converted into an order in council, which in turn would be communicated to the Dominion of Canada.
So the order in council was simply to send the communication.
Correct.
Thank you.
So these orders in council, when you look at them in the archives, they don't say very much, but they append usually the actual correspondence, which
Okay.
would in this case be Mowat's opinion.
So this then is the first time we see an order in council from Ontario.
Yes.
Okay.
So this was sent to the Secretary of State for Canada, and so it became officially Ontario's response to Canada's first order in council. And as I said earlier, Ontario never responded to the second one because the second one was considered to be superfluous since the first one involved a request on the same subject matter.
Okay.
So now we get to how did Mowat come to this conclusion? And this was based on information provided by Ontario's Commissioner of Crown Lands, who at the time was a man named Timothy Pardee. And Pardee's research, as far as I could tell from the record, is the first recorded effort since Andrew Russell in 1857 to try and systematically calculate the proceeds specifically for the purpose of ascertaining whether the conditions of the RSD augmentation clause had been met. As I said earlier, there are hints that this process had been gone through from time to time, but this is our best written record of this happening, and it was in response to Mowat's request for research.
And can you remind us what hints you suggested? What are you referring to there?
That was Sprague's allusion in his memo of 1873. Remember where he said, it has been contended from time to time up until recent times that the proceeds were not sufficient. Right. So according to Pardee, quote, on account of lands on the north shore of Lake Superior, embraced in the Treaty of the 7th September 1850, monies to the amount of about 382,000 have been received on accounts of mining locations on unsurveyed lands, of timber and of sales of lands in the surveyed townships, viz. That's VIZ, which means, in other words, namely 110,000 before and 272,000 since Confederation in 1867. So that's the information that Mowat had.
And this number by Pardee, are those gross or net? Do you know? Can you comment on that?
Yes, so in slide 83, I talk about how these helped or did not help. Obviously, if you give a figure for the entire period prior to 1867, and then for the entire period after 1867, it doesn't really help you much in identifying the year in which the conditions of the augmentation clause were met.
The specific year.
Yes. And Pardee also failed to indicate whether his 380,000 figure was net or gross. It turns out it was gross. We know that from actually looking at the record and from later calculations that his own department made, that his successor made. In fact,
But if I'm right, this is 2 years after Sprague has said, doesn't look like there'll be sufficient income for some time.
no.
Wasn't Sprague 1873?
No, Your Honor, it's Russell who.
Or sorry,
Russell was 1857. Russell is the one who said he didn't think there'd be income for some time to come. Sprague thought that by now in 1873, he didn't know what the figure was, but he knew that, from he sensed that, from timber alone in the RHT, there's got to be enough.
Yes, okay. I for me, I misheard your reference back to Sprague, 1873. Thank you.
So
1893?
as we'll see later, the actual net proceeds for the entire period, 1850 to 74, was closer to 117,000.
And that's for the entire period before and after Confederation, obviously.
Yes,
We had broken it down on the previous slide.
yes.
Okay. Please continue.
So even this lower amount, though, and this is me pointing this out, even this lower amount would have been sufficient to establish a capital fund to pay for the maximum augmentation under the RSD as it had been envisioned by Sprague. Sprague had been living and he saw these numbers. He would have said, look, of course, let's go ahead with this. This is enough, right? We don't need any more. This is enough to provide a capitalized fund to add to the existing annuity fund for the RSD.
And are you referring there to the previous table of Sprague's numbers you took us to?
Yes.
I believe that
So
was
even
slide-
if, I'm
I
sorry,
believe that was slide 70. We see total numbers there of the capital funds needed. You
Yes.
took us through that.
yes. Yeah, but I emphasize that's my conclusion, right? This is not something party concluded or MOAT concluded, right?
Okay.
You just do the math, it's simple math, right? And so if you use these numbers, it would have been sufficient. But there's still a lot of unknowns. And of course, party was never able to calculate the revenues from the RHT because the eastern boundary had not been defined by Canada. And keep in mind that these treaties, my testimony here, and for reasons, because the trial has taken a certain turn, so it focuses on the RST more than I normally would, because the Crown officials regarded these as a set. They didn't focus on one or the other. They regarded it as a set.
One moment. Your Honor, if you've lost your place, I don't know where it's.
No, thanks. I just wanted to go back to that chart
Slide 70,
70.
70.
Thank you.
It's on the screen if it helps, Your Honor.
No, I've got it. I just wanted to mark it. Thank you.
Sorry, Dr. Von Gernert, you were saying
Yeah,
about the distinction between the RHT and the RST in your own work?
yes. I mean, here I'm focusing on the RST, but the officials back then saw these as a set. A single Robinson Treaty that had two different components to it, an RST and an RHT component. So party, as I said, was not able to calculate the revenues for the RHT lands because of the ambiguities of the territorial definition in the treaty, which is the reason why MOAT said that he had been unable to determine the amount. He could only do the RSD estimate. However, by his communication to Canada, he committed his province to agree that the RHT annuitants were similarly entitled to the maximum augmentation. I mean, it was a guess. But he said, basically what he was saying is we got to give them the benefit of the doubt. all of this was based on very crude estimates, but the benefit of the doubt was given to the Anishinaabe. And now Ontario, as well as Canada, agreed that the augmentation should proceed.
Your Honor, we've
Yes.
finished one particular section of chapter 5. I wonder before we move on, if this would be an appropriate time to take the morning break.
Well,
Do you have a preference?
we usually break at 11:30, but I'll check with the reporter. We'll probably still go till 1.
Happy to keep going.
What's your preference? Let's keep going for a bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
I just asked because this next section is longer, but that's fine. The next section then, Dr. Von Gurnett starts at slide 84. We're still, of course, in chapter 5, and you've entitled this section Parliamentary Debates on Annuity Augmentation. Can you take us through this?
So in November of 1874, the Garden River Band, which was, as I said, an RHT band, assembled in council, and they discussed the augmentation clause issue. And they then communicated their concerns through the local land agent.
And sorry, who's the local land agent? Or either if you have their name or just
Yeah,
place it for me in government. if you
Yeah,
don't mind.
I don't recall who he was at the time. It may be in my report. But they, he was sort of the individual in charge of anything related to lands. But the person that they lobbied the most was Boron, because he was a politician and who was much better positioned to give them the satisfaction they wanted. And so Boron got word of this. He heard about the Garden River Band Council, and he immediately wrote Laird and reminded Laird that the annuities payable were still due. And he says, quote, they should, quote, have been $4 per head per annum for some time past, end quote, instead of the smaller amount that they were receiving. So again, he's stressing that $4 are due, but not just now, for some time past. Because you remember earlier, he had already talked about, arrears and interest and all of that. So the Deputy Minister of the Interior, Edmund Meredith, responded and said, look, just be patient. It's under review. There's a communication at the top levels of government happening. But Boron was still not satisfied by that, and he so then he rose in the House during a parliamentary debate on the last day of March in 1875 to raise the issue before Parliament.
And I think at the next slide, we go through that.
Yes, so this is Boron's speech in the Parliament of Canada, according to the Hansard record, which is the official record of the House of Commons. Quote, a grievance of which the Indians in the district of Algoma complained and which involved a claim amounting to about $50,000. So 25 years ago, they entered into a treaty to surrender the territory extending from Penetanguishene to Pigeon River, embracing nearly the north half of the province of Ontario. They surrendered that territory for a payment of $6.50 for each member of the tribe cash down and an annuity of $1.25 each. The treaty contained the following clause, and then there's a transcript of the RST augmentation clause. Now, the territory had yielded a very large amount of money from mineral and timber lands, as well as from agricultural lands that had produced little short of $1 million. And not 1 cent had been paid those Indians, although they were entitled to the full annuity of $4 per head. They endeavored to bring their case to the notice of the government in every way that was open to them, but as yet nothing had been done to remedy a long-standing injustice. They were peaceable and law-abiding. Perhaps if they had not been so peaceable in their interests, they would not have been so long neglected.
And can you explain what Boron was referring to when he said that the Indians had a claim amounting to about $50,000?
Yeah, it's a good question, because that figure kind of comes out of the blue. But it's really not that far off from the slide at slide 70, which is Sprague's proposed solution. Remember the figure 51,770 was his capitalization at 6%.
Is that just a coincidence?
I don't know. I'm just pointing out that it's not that far off. I don't know where, I mean, it's a round figure.
Was there ever a case in the past where the Anishinaabe referred to capitalized amounts?
I don't think they referred to capitalized amounts, no.
I mean, you took us through Sprague's memo. Do you know if Boron had access to it?
I do not know that. Sprague's memo was eventually published in on order of the government. All of this correspondence and memos and so forth were eventually published, but I don't believe that it was available at the time of this speech. And we do, of course, have Boron's own understanding as communicated later. And it has different figures. So the short answer is we can only speculate as to where this 50,000 came from, but it's not unsurprising that Boron would when he's making his speech, he's basically saying, look, the claim really is, we're only talking 50 grand here. And look at how many proceeds are coming out of the lands. So he's saying that, the liability is a fixed amount, and B, that fixed amount is lower than what the proceeds would allow for if they were capitalized. So, and that is consistent with what he later advised, as we'll see.
So what happened after Boron's speech?
So the Minister of the Interior and the superintendent, who's of course the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, David Laird, he responds.
We're on page 86 now?
Yes.
Is that right?
He responds basically by saying, it's Ontario, not Canada, because remember, they're in the House of Commons in Canada. And so Laird sort of says, well, you know, this is not really Canada's
Thank you.
Yeah, so basically Laird couldn't do much except respond that, you know, there is this communication going on at the highest level between the two governments. And, you know, not much else could be done because until the result of that correspondence and communication led to some action. So then there were other voices too during that same debate. The Prime Minister, Alexander Mackenzie, also asserted, or at least implied, that Ontario should pay, while Edward Blake, who at the time was the MP for Bruce South, as well as the former Prime Minister, was Sir John A. Macdonald, now in opposition, they either asserted or implied that Canada was obliged to pay the Anishinaabe no matter what. They were due these annuities, and they should be paid. The compromise that had been proposed by Premier Mowat, by which Canada would pay until the issue was adjudicated in the courts, was not even discussed. It didn't come up during those debates. So now you've got the emergence of sort of positions that are not totally in line with one another, even within the Canadian context. Ontario was always, you know, pretty consistent in the view that it was not responsible for actually paying the annuities, only for providing the information.
So following the debate, can you take us through what happened?
So the day after the debate, the debate sort of ended. It may have gone on if it wasn't a Friday afternoon, but it ended on the evening of the last day of March. And then the day after, immediately Boron got his pen out and started writing a written argument in which he said, in part, in view of the opinions expressed in the House last evening, that the Dominion government is bound under the Robinson treaties to see that the Indians who were parties to that treaty shall be paid the full amount of annuity to which they may be entitled. I beg respectfully to submit the matter for your consideration and trust that on consultation with your colleagues, you may yet be able to see your way to paying them $4 per head this year, with the emphasis in the original.
And this year is 1875.
That's correct.
So is Boron an MP in the opposition? I mean, he's taking a run at the government.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Well, he's communicating with the he's been communicating with the minister who's in charge of Indian
Mhm.
affairs. So he's taking a run at the government, and he's pressing him despite
But do we know if he's a backbencher
yeah, he's a backbencher.
in opposition?
I think so. So at the end of the day, he is pressing. The government is waiting for what to do with this, because they now need their own Ontario needs its response from Canada to MOAT. And so Canada now has to respond to Ontario. And that's basically the only holdup that's going on. So what was interesting about this whole thing is that now Boron decides, maybe these parliamentarians don't really know what the figures are and what's going on. So I'm going to give them a hypothetical scenario based on whatever numbers he had available or could muster from records that we don't know one way or the other that he had. So he did a cost analysis in this same submission to Laird, reflecting his understanding of how this should work. And he also understood that the augmented annuity payable was a function of population. And so in that sense, his view is just like Sprague's. So he assumed a combined RST and RHT population of 3,572. Where he got that figure, I don't know. It's very specific, but he as an MP, he did have certain powers to elicit information, and that was his latest understanding of the population as of the most recent one. It's not the time of treaty population. It's the most recent one he had. So he assumed that population, and he also then assumed an augmentation of $3 per head. So that would be the difference between the pre-augmented annuity and the fully augmented annuity to $4. The difference he thought was about $3. So he's using a round figure. It's not precise, but he's doing this for illustrative purposes.
So what would he have been assuming then that each annuitant was receiving in both the territories?
Well, about a dollar, right? Because the difference he's saying is $3, right? I mean, it's not actually a dollar, but it's a hypothetical based on numbers that may not be too far off. He doesn't have the exact numbers. And so then he does this calculation, and he basically thinks that if you do
Try and deal with technology and take a break. We should take- what do you think? All right, so we'll take 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
All right. This court recess for 20 minutes.
We're all right.
Court will now resume. You may be seated.
Fingers crossed. Okay, good. Okay, good.
Thank you. A couple of clarifications perhaps and housekeeping points first, Your Honor. Earlier this morning, I asked you with respect to the memorandum that Dr. Von Gernert has commended you to, which is footnoted at footnote 457 of his report.
Yes,
I suggested to you that I could find or have my colleagues find for you what exhibit that is.
excellent.
Okay. I have a copy of how it is that I could pass to you along with what we believe is also a transcription of it.
Great.
Great.
So this is the April 13th. Is that it?
Perhaps I can ask Dr. Von Gernert to confirm.
1873.
April,
Yeah, at footnote 457 of my report, I cite Sprague's memorandum of April 13th, 1873. I cite 3 different versions. There's the one found in the Library and Archives of Canada, which is an original handwritten one. Then there is the copy that was also attached to the Order in Council of July 9th, 1873, which is also in the public archives. And finally, there's a transcript that was published in the sessional papers of the 4th Parliament of the Dominion of Canada. So those 3 are cited at my footnote 457. They
And
have
you've-
varying degrees of legibility.
that's the key.
Thank you.
I'm happy to pass this up to your honor, and I can ask Dr. Von Gernert to identify them.
Thank you. And it's exhibit, I presume that's 1-2187.
That's correct, Your Honor. And of course, Exhibit 1 is the joint book of documents that was marked at the beginning of stage 3.
Right. Okay, well, I have the one that's completely illegible. The handwritten one.
If I can be of assistance. In phase 1, both the handwritten document and the transcription of it appear in trial exhibit 1-1095 in relatively legible form.
Do I have to worry? Does anyone say I have to worry about the handwritten one?
Well, I don't say you have to worry, but I believe in his report, and I thought in evidence yesterday, but maybe I've just dreamt it. Dr. Von Gernert mentions that there are slight variations in the handwritten as opposed to the transcription version. I believe them to be immaterial, but I don't want to speak for Dr. Von Gernert or
Okay.
my friend.
Well, having not heard any specific references to a difference, I will thank you for getting to me a copy of the transcription in tab 1-2187, which I was under, is also from the phase 1 trial exhibit 1-1095. I've got it. Thank you.
Dr. Von Gernert, just for the court and the record, are you able to identify what you've been passed up?
Yes, the handwritten version is the one that's in the Public Archives of Canada, or Library and Archives Canada, as it's now known. And the file number matches the one that's in my footnote. The second one, the transcript, appears to be it doesn't have a cover letter, but it appears to be a transcript that was published in the sessional papers. I can only assume that because it doesn't have a cover letter. Or I should say a cover page that from the volume in which it came from.
When you say a transcript, it's a transcript of what, doctor?
It appears to be a transcript of the handwritten memo. As I said, I referred to 3 different sources. The first one I can confirm is the handwritten one from the Public Archives. And as I said, there's a second copy attached to the Order in Council, which is also extant and which I looked at. And thirdly, there was a transcript, a published transcript, and the one that is given here resembles the one that I saw, but I can't absolutely confirm without it having the,
I'm content. Thank you. It's
Thank you,
just,
Your Honor. Thank you, Dr. Von Gurnett. On 2 points of clarification, I wonder if or rather, if I can direct you, Dr. Von Gurnett, to page, not slide, page 232 of your report. This is in chapter 5. Before we broke, you were speaking about MP Boren. And if I recall correctly, the court asked you a question about whether he was an opposition MP or he was an MP for the governing party. I wonder if you could read the passage in the middle of 232, it might provide some clarification or jog your memory about that.
yes. Yeah, I stand corrected. So I did actually in my report refer to him as the Liberal MP for the Algoma district. So he was in fact serving under the Liberal administration of Alexander Mackenzie.
So he was part of the governing party. He was
Yes.
not a cabinet minister, but an MP.
Yes,
The final point of clarification has been raised by my friends. You mentioned on a couple of occasions, the last day of March, it would be March 31, 1875, that there was a debate in the House that has been memorialized by Hansard, and you took us through that. You suggested that that was a Friday and that the debate ended early as a result of it being a Friday. Do you recall that?
yeah, it may not have been a Friday, but it was very late in the day. Yeah, I don't recall if it was it was actually a Friday, but it was. I do recall that it was specifically mentioned as ending late in the day on the 31st of March.
In fact, Mr. Schachter points out to us that it was a Wednesday. Do you,
it was a short week.
a short week, government short week. Do you know why the debate might have ended when it did?
Supper time, I assume.
Thank you. If we can turn back to your slides then.
Before we continue, just to clear up the record, my friend handed up 2 documents in respect of the April 13, 1873 Sprague memo. One was the handwritten memo, which she identified as trial exhibit 1-2187. But the record does not disclose what the transcription was, what trial exhibit it was.
I'm sorry, I've marked that on it.
2049.
Thank you.
I just thought it should be noted on the record.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schachter. Now, before we took the break and lost our technology, I believe you were halfway through slide 87. Could we continue with that, Dr. Von Gurnett?
Yes. So we were talking about how a boron, much like Sprague, did a cost analysis based on whatever figures he could find. The population number seems to be very specific. And he used a 6% interest to calculate that you needed a capital sum of 178,600. And then you may recall from slide 70 that Sprague, that little table I had in slide 70, Sprague had calculated at 6% interest that you would need 120,470. These figures are for the combined RST and RHT. So Boron's estimate of the capitalization is higher than Sprague's, who had better access to the data. However, both were basically using the same reasoning and the same logic and the same assumptions that underlay all of this. They just came up with two different figures.
And they were using different population numbers. right?
Yes, that was the most important variable.
Okay, and then if we can turn to the next slide, the parliamentary debates discussion continues.
So the parliamentary debates were done, but this is now still Boron's day after written argument that he sent, right? So he asserted, without giving any evidence, that the timber sales alone yielded more than 178,600. Sorry, they yielded more than the 178,600 capital that was required to fully augment the Robinson Treaty annuities.
Am I on slide 88 or 89?
88.
Thank you.
So as did most other officials at the time, he assumed that the full amount of the annuity was the sum that was sufficient to provide for $4 per capita. So I quote from him, quote, "If the question to be decided now was the amount due to the Indians for arrears of annuity, I grant that some delay might be necessary in order to obtain the necessary statements from the Ontario government. But the question is whether in future those Indians shall receive the full amount of annuity, $4 per head per annum, secured to them by a solemn treaty made in the name of Her Majesty the Queen. I contend that there is quite sufficient proof at hand to enable you to decide this question at once, and that too in the affirmative." And then he went on to suggest that, much like Dawson, he noted the poverty of the Anishinaabe and their unemployment, and suggested that it'd be cruel to delay these payments any further.
And this, the day after the debate, remind me who was Warren writing to?
He's writing to Laird, right, who's the minister in charge of Indian Affairs.
Okay, and do we know what happened to Laird's correspondence or?
So this
he-
is, sorry, this is an MP to the minister,
Yes,
government MP to the minister.
that's right.
Thank you.
And you may recall that he had threatened to bring the matter before the House
Mhm,
earlier,
which he did.
which he did.
You changed topics on the next slide. We start with a subsection called Blake's legal opinion. I'm on slide 89.
Yes.
Can you provide us with some background as to who Blake was?
Yeah, so in the meantime, what's happening now, Blake, again, he's another one of these interesting characters in this story, and I, actually quoted him in the title of my entire report. So he has some importance. He was the Ontario Premier in 1871 to 72, very brief period. And then there was some rule that required that you can't be in both a provincial and federal jurisdiction at the same time, because there were actually, believe it or not, some individuals who carried responsibilities in both governments. So he resigned from being the Ontario Premier and actually convinced Mowat to become Premier. Mowat had been under him in his premiership. And so now he becomes the MP for Bruce South.
Can you orient us? Where's that area?
That's in Southern Ontario down here, Bruce County.
Not here,
No,
not here.
no, I'm sorry.
You said.
I thought you
down
said
here.
down here.
No, I mean, I'm sorry,
relative.
I forgot I'm in Sudbury. I mean, in Southern Ontario, in, I'm assuming that's in the vicinity of Bruce County. So it's.
Not Robinson Treaty Territory.
No. So he was the MP there from 1872 to 1877. So he was part of this government, and he had an interesting relationship with Mackenzie. In fact, the two of them, I mean, Blake was a prominent legal scholar. He started, Blake and Company, a big legal firm that still exists today, Blakey's. And he also, because Mackenzie was a stonemason by trade, Mackenzie always relied on Blake for legal advice.
And of course, Mackenzie is who?
He is now the prime minister at the time, right? So, but the two of them always had a bit of tension between them because Blake was supposed to become the prime minister. He had better credentials, but Mackenzie ended up becoming one, and it's a long story. But anyway, at the end of the day, to smooth things over, Blake was given the portfolio of Minister of Justice.
And in that capacity, how was he involved with the Robinson treaties?
So one of the first things that came across his desk was Mowat's legal opinion. And of course, he knew Mowat from the days when they were serving in the same government. So he's an old friend of his. And they had mutual respect for one another. And so Mowat's legal opinion had to be looked at by Blake. And so Blake's own legal opinion concluded, and as I gave in the bullets on slide 89, he concluded that at least some increase in the RHT annuity had been claimable by 1867, and that, quote, the full augmentation up to $4 a head, end quote, had been payable for some years prior to 1875. It didn't say how many, but they're often guessing, just based on the little information they had. And in his view, the liability that a government had to the Indians came within Section 111 of the BNA Act, regardless of whether Canada could claim that the lands in question were subject to a Section 109 charge. So this was a legal analysis of the BNA Act, and sort of begins the process of setting up what a court might later have to decide. And then he said, given the circumstances connecting with the obtaining of this treaty in particular, and to the general policy of the Canadian and British governments with reference to the Indians, it was, quote, of great importance that their just demand should be met without further delay, end quote. And the page from which that is derived is actually on the cover of my report. That's the original letter. So he suggested that Canada should adopt Mowat's suggestion that Canada proceed immediately with the payment to the maximum amount, while the matter of arrears would be sorted out, and also the question of which level of government was ultimately liable for the cost would work its way through the courts. And Blake was one of the individuals who actually was at the forefront of trying to establish a Supreme Court of Canada. And he, he'd been lobbying for that for some time, and it was his expectation that that there would be a Supreme Court of Canada set up very shortly. And he thought that this would be an issue that could be put before them in short order.
Okay, and then you move to another topic on the next slide. Slide 90, I think.
Yes.
Can you tell us about Laird's costing and the order in council, as you entitle it?
Yeah, so Blake's opinion goes then to Laird, and Laird then would be responsible for putting together an opinion that would be prepared for the Privy Council's consideration. And so Laird, what he did is he calculated the increase due under each treaty by multiplying what he understood as, quote, maximum amount of annuity, end quote. He assumed that to be the $4 per capita. He multiplied that amount by the most recent population figure, not as Sprague had earlier recommended. Remember, Sprague had recommended the time of treaty population. Laird used the latest population figure.
And why would that have been significant or relevant for him to choose that number?
Well, it would result in an entirely different calculation. He never explains why he chose that number as opposed to the time of treaty population number. I don't think, after Sprague's death, I really don't think that Sprague's original memos had even been read. This is based on Laird's own independent analysis and reading. He decided to go with, I suppose if he had read Sprague's memorandum, he may have decided on something different, but this was his own independent way of doing this. And so I think what happened here was he decided, it makes more sense to use the current population.
And then what did he do?
So then he subtracted from the sum the pre-augmented annuity that was already annually being paid through the interest from a different capitalized sum, because you had to subtract that. And if you did that, you ended up with a figure of 10,484 to fund the difference for 1875.
And which treaty or treaties are we speaking of here?
We're talking about both treaties together. A total amount of 10,484.
For a single year?
Yes, for the year 1875. That's the amount that would be required to augment the annuities from their existing amounts to the $4 per capita maximum. So because he thought that, by the time you pay this annuity, which would be months away, there could be slight differences in the numbers. And so he suggested, well, let's round this off, make it an even 11,000. And so he recommended depositing 11,000 into the annuity funds of the Robinson treaties and have this charged against, quote, unforeseen expenses, end quote. So now he did not urge the creation of a capital sum. So in this sense, he also differed from Sprague. He wasn't talking here about a capital sum.
Do you know why not?
I think the main reason, I thought about this for days on end. I think the main reason was that the government was in the midst of, he had just read Blake's legal analysis. And he knew that this whole matter of who was ultimately responsible for payment would come before the courts shortly. And so he thought, well, we better do this on a year-by-year basis, because who knows what's going to happen. Like, the immediate concern was get the payment out right away for the current year.
So he makes this recommendation. Do you know what happened to that recommendation?
Yes, on July 22nd, 1875, a Dominion of Canada Order in Council, excuse me, approved his recommendations. And this became the first legal authority for the payment of a Robinson Treaty annuity augmentation.
And then over on the next slide, that's not surprising, you have a title paying the augmented annuities. Can
Yeah,
you take
so-
us through this?
Yeah, so the 11,000 then was appropriated from the CRF and divided between the RST and RHT. And then I began looking at the Receiver General's ledgers again to see what's going on with these monies. And I also went to the Indian Affairs ledgers, and sure enough, we get these credits. So the RST annuity fund reflected a credit of 3,058.48. So there was obviously, it was right down to the cents. And this, there's a caption that read, to raise Robinson Treaty annuity to $4 per head to 1,300 persons. That was actually, if you see the ledger, it's actually written in there to explain why there's this new amount that suddenly come in on credit. And this had come from the quote unquote government for the Lake Superior portion of the quote grant under Order of Council of 22nd of July. So the Receiver General's ledger, you recall, Your Honor, the ledgers that where there were columns and totals under the annuity fund for Robinson Superior, there was this annotation as to where this new fund came from. And then checks were cut for each of the Indian agents who had jurisdictions in the various treaty territories, and they would then cause the distribution of the annuities. And then this continued the same way over and, you know, as it turned out, the court did not, you know, there was no decision on this because the whole thing went to arbitration, and there was a whole other series of events that occurred, which are explained in more detail later.
When you say this continued, what are you referring to?
So the money used to fund the annuity augmentations, this $11,000, never came from the proceeds from the lands. It always came from the CRF fund. And that amount would then be obtained through the usual supply bill. The same one that was used during the 1850s and 1860s continued right into the 1870s. The same process of obtaining the funding through a supply bill. This became known as the Appropriation Act. So there was an actual statute that provided for certain monies to be appropriated for the expenses of the government. And under that Appropriation Act, each time you see the 11,000 in there, year after year, until it was increased, as I'll demonstrate in a second. So for example, the 1876 version, granted Her Majesty a sum, quote, from and out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund of Canada, end quote. So there was an amount of 11,000, and then, quote, to bring up the annuities under the Robinson Treaty, end quote, to the $4 per head. And that same process occurred year after year throughout the entire rest of the 19th century.
And I think you just suggested that that number sometimes fluctuated. Is that what you described?
Yes.
On the next slide?
Yes.
We're on slide 92.
Yeah, so the thing, this became increasingly complicated, and I'm not going to, repeat everything on slide 92 on the record again. But you can see just by the quoted portion that I draw attention to how complicated this was starting to get. This is an actual handwritten comment on the original RHT annuity fund ledger. And it's, it speaks for itself. I don't need to repeat it in all its complexity. So they tried to forecast, how much they would need. Like the 11,000 was generally sufficient in the early years. But because of population fluctuations, obviously it had to be increased eventually. But in the meantime, the 11,000 covered it. Even if they didn't need all of it, it was still there. It was kept in the accounts. So it's not as if the 11,000 was just an estimate to cover anything up to 11,000, right? So
the 11,000, what you're saying was until the end of the 19th century was always sufficient to make payments based on the calculation of $4 per person on the census.
yes, except that it was not always sufficient, as I will explain in the next slide.
Okay.
But the underlying premise was that it always had to be enough, whatever the figure was, whether it's 11,000 or 14,000, it had to be enough to cover every entitled Anishinaabe under the Robinson treaties to allow them $4 per capita.
And I just have one question. You have said a number of times that this is complicated.
Yes.
It seems to me a pretty simple math multiplication, just that the population changes. Like it's $4 times
Yes.
a number on a census.
Absolutely, you would think so. And at first blush, I always said exactly the same thing. But then when you start looking at a passage like this, you begin to realize there's a lot more to it. There are also issues of entitlement, which come into the whole picture, because over time,
Determining entitlement is a different issue than calculating, though, isn't it? Once you determine entitlement, that's one of the factors in this multiplication.
yes. However, entitlement was important to determine before you even had the estimates drawn from the Consolidated Revenue Fund, because
Sorry,
some
I'm just trying to figure out what's complicated. So what complicated possibly is entitlement,
that's
but not the
one.
calculation.
Well, the actual math, of course, is it's a matter of math. That's not
Okay.
complicated, right? But the
So there were
numbers,
complications determining how many, as you call them, entitled beneficiaries there were.
yes,
In any one year.
yes. And that, of course, changed from one year to another.
Right. Okay.
And then there was also a matter of, well, what happens if there's still amounts left over? you know, where does that go and how is that administered? And I mean, it's,
And can you explain why would there be amounts left over?
well, because these are always estimates, so now round numbers, right? They're intended to cover, but they may be more than you need.
More than you need, why?
Well, because at the beginning of the year, when you provide for 11,000, I mean, look at the first example. Laird said, look, you know, the actual figure, he had an actual figure based on the population. The actual figure was 10,484, right? But he recommended a round sum of 11,000, right? So that already indicates to you that he's trying to build into this the possibility that the numbers are going to change, right?
I think I have it.
So, and the forecasts rarely turned out to be accurate. So, and because of that, the numbers had to be changed. That is, the funding had to be changed, right? So, and before I explain that, you'll see on the slide 93 that you've got the balance sheets again showing the various sums. This is the one for the Ojibwas of Lake Superior in their account. So you see there the 40,000 capital sum that was originally drawn in 1869 from the CRF.
That's at the second column?
Yes. And then you see, so that's the pre-augmented annuities that would be paid using the annual interest. And then you see a sum of 3,235.55. You see that in the right-hand column, second entry, 3,235.55. It's, I guess for convenience, it's listed as interest, but it's not actually interest. Rather, that's the portion of, that's the RST portion of the 11,000 that year.
And the remaining was where?
The remaining is with the RHT fund in its column, right?
Oh, right, this is the RSP.
Yeah, this is just for the Lake Superior. So,
Sorry, for clarity's sake, the remaining of what? Because there's lots of numbers on this chart.
yeah, so the remaining, so you subtract $3,235.55 from 11,000.
Laird's 11,000 that he had.
Yes, and then that would be in the RHT. So that's how these things were distributed. And
If I understand this chart, on each side of the center line, they both have credited 40,000. And then what's paid to them is their portion of the 40. And what's shown as a balance is what goes to the other territory. Do I have that right?
no, the 40,000 is always there. It has to be there on both sides of the sheet, right? It's got to be, because that's the capital. It does not leave ever. It's always the same because that is never touched. It's never.
I missed it then.
It's never drawn on. The 40,000 is never drawn on because it's only the interest
Okay.
on the 40,000.
So that's the third column there, I think. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yes, the interest that you see is 7,037.42, right?
Mhm.
So that's what's drawn. So every year you need to balance that out because that goes in through interest and goes out through the pre-augmented annuity payment. The 40,000 stays. It never leaves the account. Right, it's a permanent capital sum allocated for RST.
So when you say the interest of $7,037.42 is drawn, it's drawn for what?
Well, for purposes of paying out the pre-augmented annuity. Now, that's a total because there's also, there may be some left over from the distribution, right? You see there's a distribution of Robinson Treaty money. It says 6,400. So that's the actual amount distributed.
This is column 3.
Yes. So my point here is that leaving that all aside, because that deals with the pre-augmented annuity portion. The only portion that involves the augmented annuity, that is the difference between the pre-augmented annuity and the cap and the $4 maximum. That is the government, that is the 3, 2, 3, 5, and 55 cents that you see, which is the RST portion of the 11,000. You see where it says government for proportion of 11,000. The government is the source. Right, that's the annual.
And the 11 is the $4.
The
It's the
11
difference in order to get to $4.
exactly. So they already have the 40,000, which generates their interest to provide them the pre-augmented annuity. And now they also have their portion of the 11,000.
And what's the 2,376?
That's just the balance from in 1877. So, you know, as I said earlier,
Is that paid to RST, that amount?
that amount is what is a balance in their account. So irrespective of whatever monies they get in, there still may be a balance at the end of the year because it may not all have been paid out over the years because of population fluctuations and so forth. So there's always something left in the account.
Ah,
It's
okay.
not, you know, it's not zero every year.
so it's the balance plus
Yes.
their portion of the 11,000.
Yes, so they get their portion of the 11,000, no matter whether they have already a balance there or not.
Right, just like the old days. They got their money on the 40 and sometimes it left a balance and sometimes it didn't, perhaps.
Is there anything else you want to tell us about slide 93 before we move on?
No,
94? We're still on the topic of paying the augmented annuities.
yes. So as I said, this was basically much like what happened before. The augmented portion was never derived from proceeds. However, what's going on now is that unlike in the past, where the Anishinaabe would be receiving, you know, $1.50 one year, $1.49 another year, $1.61 one year, 90 cents the next year. Now, every year they're getting $4. It's a predictable $4 every year, no matter what.
Mhm.
And so this meant, of course, that as the population of the eligible annuitants rose or fell, the amount of the grant would have to be changed. And so at first, as I said, you know, it was, you know, 11,000 was sufficient. But over time, they had to raise it to 14,000. So after 1878, we begin seeing instead of 11,000, 14,000. And then in 1881, it was reduced to 13,000. And then once it was even down to 10,000. But then during the early 1880s, it was back up to 15,680. And then for the remaining of the 1880s, it was fixed at 15,588. And then eventually this was increased to 16,806. And that amount continued annually throughout the 1890s and into the early 1900s, at which point I no longer tracked them. So so you see what's going on here is that as the population fluctuated, you have to adjust the annual estimates.
Mhm.
And
Population was going in a certain direction though.
yes, the tendency was to go up. And so that's why by the 1890s, it was 16,806. Now, on top of that, as I said, because it was somewhat complicated with all these fluctuations, and because the accounting was complicated as a consequence of that, in some years, even the amount that they had estimated, which was usually more than they needed, it was not enough. And so they had to have an additional grant on top of the amount. So for example, in the 1890s, it was 16,806. However, even that number was not enough. So in 1895, 1897, and 1898, they supplemented it with additional amounts to cover the shortfalls. Again, the assumption underlying this is that you always have to keep them at $4. And everyone who was entitled to that $4, and you had to have enough money to cover that.
Can we look at slide 95? You continue with the topic here and you talk about some of the jurisdictional issues that had provided some complications as between the governments.
Yes, so they, you know, I mean, the Anishinaabe were now getting $4 every year. And at the same time, there were still these jurisdictional issues that were unresolved about who would pay. And the jurisdictional issue ultimately was immaterial from the Anishinaabe side, because so long as they were still getting the $4, it didn't really matter whether it came from Canada or from Ontario or, you know, where the source was. Their complaint had always been, you know, we don't just want to get our $1.10 or $1.05 or 90 cents or whatever. We want the full $4. And that's what they were now getting as of 1875. And in that year, Van Cougnet, who remember was the guy who replaced Sprague after his death, he had to give his annual report. And so this is just a quote from his annual report. A quote, by an order in council of the 22nd of July, 1875, the annuities payable under the Robinson Treaty of 1850 to the Ojibwas of Lakes Huron and Superior were this year advanced from less than $1 per capita in one case and slightly over that amount in the other to $4, the maximum amount to which under the terms of those treaties they could be increased. This question had been for a long time before the department, and the increase this year to their annuities, which it is trusted will be continued, has given great satisfaction to the Indians interested. So that was sort of his succinct summary of what happened in 1875. And all I suggest here is his view that the maximum amount to which under the terms of the treaties, they were entitled was $4, is consistent with the view of other government officials at the time.
And you said that this is found in his report, his annual report.
Yes.
Is there anybody responding to that report that you know of?
No, I don't know if, I don't know anyone who's responding to it. I didn't cite anything in my report as to who's responding to it.
Do you know if these reports become published, or do they just?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all of the reports of the annual reports of officials are all printed the year in which they're prepared.
We have one final slide for chapter 5. I think closing out the paying the augmented annuities discussion. Could you take us through that? I'm at slide 96.
Yeah, so remember what I said earlier about Laird, when he came up with this, the reason why he didn't contemplate capitalization is most likely because he thought he better do this on a year-by-year basis, because this issue might be addressed by a court. And so, but what happened was this became the practice throughout the 19th century. This was not an interim measure awaiting judicial review, but turned into a permanent annual charge against the Canadian budget. So, it was believed by both Canada and Ontario that the proceeds had by 1874 reached a sufficiency that could produce, if you so chose, a capital sum that would allow the government to top off the annuity to its maximum amount into perpetuity, even if you factored in a population increase. Right, if you do the math, it didn't really matter whether the population was a little more. There was still enough of proceeds that were thought to be extant to allow the creation of such a capitalization.
And do we have Ontario or Canada officials saying that? Or do they just keep, as you said, maintain the practice of an annual allocation?
The government officials did not have the actual figures, or
No,
at
no,
least-
that wasn't my question.
I'm
You
sorry.
said it was believed
Yes,
by both Canada and Ontario that the proceeds had by this time reached a sufficiency that could produce a capital sum.
yes.
Did any official say that? And I
Well,
ask that in light of the fact that you continued in your evidence to say that the practice of an annual allocation continued.
Yes, so as I said earlier, Sprague was definitely under the impression that enough had accumulated thus far.
He's dead now. We're
No,
dealing
he's
with,
dead, yes. So Laird is working under the same assumption. He is also, as I noted earlier,
did anyone say this? Because you
Well-
said that you didn't even know if Laird read Sprague's report.
no, well, he didn't. Well, he may not have, I don't know if he did or not, but if you look at Laird's costing,
Can you direct us to a page that you're at?
Well, maybe it's an easy answer. Did Laird say this?
yeah, well, I'm looking at what he actually said here.
Okay.
Okay, so first of all, Laird is reading Blake, right? Because Blake's legal opinion has been forwarded to him for action, right? And Blake has already been on record, as has Moat, that it's time. The proceeds are sufficient to, so Laird is already working under the assumption that the proceeds are sufficient to produce a capital sum that would, that would pay for this into perpetuity. However, what he does is he, instead of capitalizing it, he calculates how much at least the current year would cost,
Mhm.
right? Just over 10,000 or 11,000 is a round number, right? So he now, as he said, and this is on page 267 of my expert opinion report.
267.
Yes. So here I give a lengthy quote. Are you there,
Yes, thank you.
Your Honor? So here he gives a lengthy quote. So here he says, look, the Honorable, the Minister of Justice, who's Blake,
Mhm.
in the report herewith submitted, is of opinion in which the undersigned has already expressed his concurrence that the Lake Huron Indians are entitled under the Treaty of 1850 to the maximum amount of annuity hereby stipulated, namely $4 per head. And it has been, there's an underlining there that the strikeout is in the original. I'm just reproducing it.
But they're in the same position they've been in for a while. That they've,
Yes,
this money's been there.
that's right. So Laird is already convinced that this is that the time is right, if not overdue.
Right.
If that answers
It doesn't, but thank you.
I think you suggested that there was a reason why he went to annual appropriation through vote rather than a capitalized sum.
yes.
Can you remind us what that was?
Well, Blake's opinion was quite clear that the matter of whether Ontario would actually be paying the proceeds from the lands to pay for these annuity augmentations would be a matter that would go to a court. And Blake thought that this was a decision that would be imminent. And Laird simply decided to do it on a year-by-year basis because these things are still up in the air, right? Because what happens if Canada commits itself to a capitalized amount, and it turns out that Ontario should be one that's committing itself to the capitalized amount, right? But not to disadvantage the Anishinaabe, you pay them in 1875, right? And I think both Mowat and Blake agreed that, there was no disagreement whatsoever that the Anishinaabe should be paid right away.
It was a fact- it was a-
Paradoxically, during that very year, there were, as we'll see, there were actually net losses as opposed to net proceeds.
But the issue was who would be the government capitalizing?
Exactly.
Maybe we can just finish off anything else you want to add about slide 96. Is there anything that we haven't covered? Perhaps not. Can you tell me?
Yeah, it's, I think it's self-explanatory. From now on, the government of the Dominion of Canada committed to pay the maximum that they thought was due under this treaty. That is $4, an amount sufficient to cover $4 per capita. And the talk of who would ultimately be liable for these payments, either pre or post Confederation or both, was a matter that eventually went to the courts.
Thank you. Your Honor, we're through chapter 5. I suggest that this might be an appropriate time to take the lunch break.
Very good. Okay. And what's the plan after lunch? Keep going?
Keep going. Yep.
Okay.
Chapter 6 is the last lengthy chapter.
So do you think you'll get through 6 and 7 today?
No,
Okay.
I don't, but I do think we're still on track to finish tomorrow.
Okay.
In sheet, as I said this morning.
And that includes the second report?
Yes, it
Exhibit
does, Your
50?
Honor.
Very good. Okay. Let's break. 2:15, 2:30. Everybody's good? What's your,
2:15 is fine.
2:15 helps you?
Sure. Is that fine for the witness?
I'm at your disposal anytime.
Very good.
2:15.
Let's do 2:15.
We'll recess until 2:15.